Switching up, if you were here this morning and yesterday, we had laughed a lot about the 50s and the 60s, and that's good. This is a little bit different presentation. It's a real presentation, and I get emotional doing it because my father is involved in it. And as I give this, I don't want to slight any of you who have been in the military. You all have your stories, and one of our goals as we work with the Browerville Legacy Museum is to keep stories alive, stories not lost. And I'd love to hear your stories in the military, so let me know so we can probably do something about it. But I know my dad's story the best. Not a lot of people talked about their experience, so we're going to go through that. Just to set the stage a little bit, without Sue Skala, we'd be lost, and my hands, put your hands together right now and thank Sue for this. She's done an unbelievable job of keeping this history alive. But so, setting the stage in the 1940s, Browerville had about 600 people in Browerville. Unfortunately, we had these men lose their lives during the war. Dan Mace is here. His uncle lost his life. In fact, Danny's middle name is Lee, after Lee Mace. Lee Konetsko's uncle lost, and I'm sure you can go down the line and say, well, I know that person, I know that person. Because of Sue, I didn't realize there were 435 men from Browerville or the Browerville area that were in World War II. That's unbelievable. And I'm going to show you the list at the end. Some families had 6 and 7 members of their family that were involved in the war. So I got this idea because of reading a book called The Greatest Generation. If you'd ever want to read a good book about what went on during World War II and after effects, Tom Brokaw has written one. And this right here got me going on this stuff. It says, when the United States entered World War II, the U.S. government turned ordinary Americans, Browervillians, and asked them to do extraordinary sacrifice, service, and heroics. Many Americans met those expectations and then returned home to lead ordinary lives. And I'm thinking, that was my dad. You know, that was all of your relatives that did that. That's unbelievable. And so my dad was like most people, never shared a story about it, so we'll get into some of this stuff. So my hat's off to Browerville because of what you do. The luminaries that you have with 1,400 people recognized last year, that was the flyer that went out on it. That's my hat's off to Browerville. That's my heart. I've left Browerville, but my heart has never left here because of the things that all of you people that are here do. So know that. So how did I realize the military at all? As a young little boy, on Memorial Day, my dad would come down from the second story where his bedroom was with his uniform on because he marched with Bob Jankowski, who was in charge, and his first statement would be, I think my uniform shrank from last year, you know, which probably all of us could say at this point in our life. And I can remember him eating breakfast, getting in the car, going up, and then I would ride my bike up to the field, and Bob Jankowski had the people practicing their marching, and I always was hoping that it wouldn't rain, because if it didn't rain, they always marched out to a cemetery. If they rained, the program was in the gymnasium. It wasn't as much fun. So the Konetskos lived right next door to us, the pink house to the south of us, and they had a son that was killed in World War II, and in their window they always had this gold star, and Mrs. Konetsko would ride in the parade, and they would stop, if it was going out to the Catholic cemetery, they'd stop at the river or creek, whatever it was on that, and the gold star mothers would get out and put flowers in the creek in honoring their son who was killed in the war. If it went out to the other cemetery, there's a creek there that they would stop at. That really made an impression on me as a young boy. But what really made the impression on me, and these are, I don't have any old ones of my time there. I got these from Sue from various Memorial Day programs in Browerville. What really made the impression on me was when the men shot their rifles for the salute, because as a little boy, then they'd eject the shell and we'd all fight for those little shells. You know, the important things of life, how many shells do you get? And then at the end, we always had an ice cream treat. So it wasn't about the program as a little kid, it was about what you got out of the program. But it also was indelible in my head, looking at Memorial Day, how important it was about being a veteran. So that got me thinking about it, and so today's story is about my mother and father in the middle, his older brother John, who was about 8 years older, and his wife Bernice, and Jack Dressen, our longtime coach, who came to Browerville after World War II, and his wife Jo. So how did I get this stuff? My dad never talked about it. Our daughter was a sophomore in high school, and in a class was asked to write a term paper, and she got the bright idea that Grandpa never talks about being in World War II. So she sent a note to my dad and to my mom, write a story about what went on during the war. She got a handwritten, and here's a copy of my mother's handwritten note that was 23 pages long about what she experienced. Here's my dad's printed story that was 28 pages long of what he experienced. So we have firsthand from their idea what went on during the war. Little fast forward, Jack Dressen's granddaughter had an assignment to do an interview. She decided to interview Jack Dressen, and he wrote, I don't know, sort of like a 26-page thing that his daughter-in-law transcribed, so I have his information of what went on during the war. So when I'm talking to you, I have the good fortune of having authentic stuff that went on. It's not made up stuff. After my dad and mom passed away, and after my aunts passed away, my cousins were going through their stuff. They found a stack of letters like this that my dad sent to his sister and sister-in-law about what was going on in World War II. So I have had that to look at, what he was experiencing. So what I'm trying to tell you is everything is authentic, and it really, you know, you go, well, why didn't I ask my dad about that, you know? So now we have it that way, so we're going with that. And this is my disclaimer to all of you that were in the military. I was not in the military. This is not to slight those of you that were in Vietnam, or those of you that were in the Middle East, or those of you that were in Korea, because you have the same experiences, and I don't know them, but I do know this, but I do know as I've thought about it and recreated it, it could be any one of you that were in the military, that were in battlefields. It could be your story too. So think about it that way. I'm not trying to brag about my dad. I'm just telling a story, and I'm telling the Browerville story, or wherever you were from as we go through that. And for those of you that had relatives that were in World War II, that were in the Pacific, I'm not trying to slight the Pacific. He was in the European side of it, and that's what I know best. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So just to introduce to you, there's my dad, and that's his picture during just 18 years old, and he's in Florida in basic training. And just to get you interested in it, one of the letters he writes back to his sister, I spent the first night in combat in a foxhole outside of Linden, Germany, where my newfound buddy of less than 24 hours flipped his lid and went berserk. And then he has in parentheses, shell-shocked. Okay? And then his older brother, John, in reading about him, he landed in France the day after Normandy invasion. Can you imagine that? Seeing all that, everything that went on during that time. And he landed the next day, fortunately. And part of my infantry fought their way through France. And then Jack Dressen wrote, the artillery was always behind the infantry. He was in the artillery. I take my hat off to every single individual who was infantry. That's my dad and my dad's brother. He said they were doing hand-to-hand fighting. We dug a foxhole every night, and every night we moved. We shot over the infantry and tried to kill the enemy's infantry people. Somebody would tell us about certain elevation of the gun, and then we'd shoot the shell to land and explode. That's just giving you a little bit of what we're going to get into, but to authenticate this. Am I in your guys' way? Okay. So how did I get into this? Back in about 2012, my son, who's sitting between my dad and myself, was in Egypt at the time and came home for Christmas. and we had Christmas morning with my dad in St. Cloud and my two sisters before we went to Iowa where we live, and we started talking, and my dad started talking just a little bit about the war. He was on the verge of having to go to a rest home, and as we did that, my son said to me, "Dad, next Christmas I'll stay in Egypt, and you come over and spend time with me, and we'll go visit the battlefield." And I said, "Sure," thinking that would never happen. Well, it did happen. So here's a picture of one of my all-time favorite pictures of my dad's family growing up. Some of you older people would remember Joe Achter. He had a tire shop in town, and my grandmother Anna. There's my dad. He was the youngest, and then Adeline, and then Leona, and then John, and their car behind. So that'll give you an idea of my dad's family growing up. So when Pearl Harbor hit, in the letter that my dad wrote to my daughter, he was still in high school, and he says, this is December, from I count my blessings that I'm not old enough to be drafted. Remember that statement. He was glad that he didn't have to go into the Army. And he talks about the small town of 566 and that 15 were killed. So that's my dad's thoughts when the war broke out. So let's look at World War II as we go through it. So a couple years later, my dad graduates, and as soon as he graduated, he got called to go get his physical, which was at Fort Snelling. And if you knew my dad, this is typical dad humor. Doctor looked in one ear and could not see daylight straight through, so I was in. So at that time, my mom, who was from Holdingford, was in Browerville, staying at Jess Hyde's house, doing student teaching out of one-room schoolhouse, and they met and they started courting after my dad had graduated. And my mom says, "I began teaching in Browerville in a one-room school. I met Grandpa." This is her telling my daughter, "I met Grandpa, and he was drafted in '44. We look forward to his furlough before he was sent overseas." And my dad, who the day after he turned 18 was in the war, drafted, he said, "I got my orders from Fort Snelling. I arrived on January '44. I signed up to get a test to go in the Air Force and made it. I reported to Fort Snelling. 1 week later, I was informed the Air Force had enough people." So he got put into the Army at that point in time. So my dad had never been out of Minnesota. Like many Minnesotans or many people that were 18, at that time he didn't travel. So he gets on a train and rides a train to Florida. And this is show you how naive he was. In his first letter home, he says, "It was a swell trip, too fast. We traveled in a troop train. I really saw some different and strange sights." You can imagine a young man traveling the train going down to Florida, the difference in what he would see, okay? So it's the first time he'd never been out of Minnesota. Here he is, 18 years old, and he's at Fort Blanding. Fortunately, his older brother was at Fort Blanding doing advanced training, and he was homesick already during that. And when you look at this, he says, "We were quarantined and no place to go. Boy, this place is a hole. There are 150,000 soldiers here. I've marched and drilled my blank out of me every day long. I'm in a different infantry than John. I did see him last night. He showed me some blisters on his feet. I'm the youngest one in the barracks." And he said, "Boy, well, I can't wait to get the Browerville blade." He couldn't wait to see what was going on. And there's and this was a letter to his sister Adeline. There's John and my dad. Okay, Jack Dressen went out of basic training and was put out in the West Coast, and he was in Camp Beale, California, and he was preparing to be in the artillery, and they were supposed to be practicing on long guns. And his story is they didn't have the long guns there, so they practiced using telephone poles as if they were shooting. They were not prepared to go across, and that was happening to him. Okay, so let's talk about when we invaded. And I found these pictures of June 5th, the day before D-Day. There's Eisenhower in the middle talking to the troops. But picture yourself being one of these people, knowing that the next day you're going to get in a boat and you're going across the English Channel, and when you get to Normandy, you're going to get into Higgins' boat, and you're going to go into shore, and the Germans are going to be up in shooting at you, and the chance of you making it isn't very good. So that's what's going on in their minds, and they're 18 and 19-year-olds. So here's pictures of Normandy, and here's the Higgins boat, people getting off, and we were involved in Omaha and Utah Beach. Gold, Juneau, and Sword were the English people, all of them going in at one time on D-Day. So my son and I, when we got there, we visited Normandy Beach. You're going to see some pictures from 2013. This is unbelievable. This is Archimachis, France, which is right on the corner of where the invasion started. And you can still see there are still Higgins boats from the 40s that are out in the water there. Have any of you visited Normandy Beach? Okay, so you'll keep me straight on this. So as you go through and see these pictures, these are authentic pictures that I found of what was going on at Normandy Beach. This is what the beach looked like the day I was there, to see it. I've never been in a place where I walked and felt more somber than walking on this beach, knowing what went on that day. Yes?
Just to add to that, we were there, we took a bus, my daughter and I, there was little kids with parents, make a noise, you get off the bus, dead silence. The kids, just like they could feel it.
Yeah, you just feel it. And I collected seashells that were coming in, and in my mind I'm collecting men that were in the war. That's my prized possession, just the seashells from there. But I couldn't believe what, and there's nothing to tell you where you're at, but small signs of all of that. So here's again what it was like on your left-hand side on the day of it. That's what it was like when I was there. And we have to remember that there weren't people just getting in Higgins boats. There were paratroopers getting in that were shot at the whole time too. So, and you can see the bunkers that the Germans were in, protected bunkers, and these people were then trying to get on the other side of those bunkers so we could come at the Germans in two different ways. So one of the biggest places in Normandy Beach is called Pointe du Hoc. It's the point of it. And there you'll see what it's like. Here's this is not a picture we took, but here's an aerial photo to see how high it is. And one of the major things that we had to do is capture Pointe du Hoc, because that was the important part. And there you're going to see the bunkers that were there waiting for people to come up those hills, that hill right there at bunkers, there. And here is a picture of troops practicing in England to get up. And there's a picture of them going up, and they actually had 90 seconds to get up to be saved. And they did make it, and they were the heroes of that point because they were able to take over those bunkers. And you can see a article from the paper. So there you're going to see Pointe du Hoc today with the bunkers. This is unbelievable. These are the crevices from the bombs that were being dropped from the American planes that are still there. And there's the memorial at Pointe du Hoc. He mentioned somber. This is the memorial for D-Day there. So that was Omaha Beach. Now this is Utah Beach. There's the only sign that we could find to take us down to Utah Beach when we were there. Again, there's the soldiers coming into Utah Beach, and there's Utah Beach the day we were there. Again, the same thing. So, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Longest Day. Sainte Marie Glaise is about 10 miles off of Normandy Beach. You remember a soldier, paratrooper came in and landed and got caught on the top of the church when the church bell's ringing. That's the church that he landed on, and they have a parachute there to remind you of what was going on. If you remember the Longest Day, that was part of that. And it's still there, right there to show you. There's the carnage that went on of human bodies during that part of the war. It was not. We were fortunate that we took it and it made the difference, but we took it with a huge expense for us. The next day, this gentleman mentioned somber. The next day, my son and I visited the cemetery. Did you visit that by any chance? Yeah, it's unbelievable walking in the cemetery from the Americans. This is the American cemetery of the American men who were killed in Normandy Beach. I've never seen anything, felt anything like walking that, and you can see it's right off of Normandy.
Yeah, my point was, little kids, you know, you see on the bus, they step
Yep.
off, and they're quiet, just like they know what's
Yeah,
going on.
yeah,
They could feel it in their parents.
yeah. So John Achter, the next day, his troop came in, and he was part of the Indian Head Infantry. So he was on Normandy Beach the second day to get brought in. So he was in a group that went and took over France to take care of the Germans. I don't know if you know the history, but France is made up of something called hedgerows, and you can see them here, but they're 4 to 8 feet tall with trees and steep banks and about 6 to 8 feet deep to prevent people from going places in France. So our people, and the Germans were on the other side, our people have to go over these hedgerows to get and make progress during that time. They fought a 39-day battle and ended at Brest, France, and won that part. Now, this is going to be a little bit graphic, but I need to tell you what happened to my uncle. He was part of this, and one day he was in a little town, and the Germans came, and the Americans scattered. And he scattered and was off by himself, and a couple of bombs went off and some shots went off. He got shrapnel in his legs. And he was by himself, and he said, how am I going to make it? And the only thing he did to make it, he saw an outhouse. And he went to the outhouse, and he went down the hole in the outhouse. And he stayed there for 3 days with the shrapnel in his legs and all of that, while people were going around. And finally, after the 3rd day, he realized that it's quiet, and he was able to get out and crawled for a way and found some Americans. They took care of him from there, and then was taken to a hospital and wasn't treated very well at that point, because how do you treat that? So that happened to my Uncle John during the war. So now Jack Dressen, he entered the war. There's Jack and his mother before he left. He said on July 2nd of 44, we sailed a very large ship called the U.S. Wakefield. The food was bad, bad, bad. And at that time, when you went to war, you were on a ship, and you didn't go straight across because of the submarines. You zigzagged so the submarines wouldn't find you. So it took twice as long to get across, and people fed the fish a lot because of that. So he got to England, and they finally had their long guns, their long toms, and for the first time, right before they're going across, they get to practice shooting the long guns. And he said, we were not prepared for this. And he was put in General Patton's army. Here's this statement, and you're going to hear this again. They say this a lot about General Patton. Oh, blood and guts, our blood and his guts. And that's the way he was the general as he fought this. And he left Wales and came into Utah Beach in August of 44 at that point in time. So he came in right here, the same place that my Uncle John came in to it. And in his letter, he said, the soldiers of D-Day, they're the ones that we have to look up to. And it hadn't been for them who cleared the way for us, it is scary to think of what I or we would be today. That was his feeling at that point as he went that. So my dad turns 19, and that you couldn't go across until you were 19. A couple weeks before 19, he had his furlough. There he is with his future wife, Jeanette Rolfus, who was teaching at that point in time. And he left Browerville, and he ended up in New Jersey, waiting till his 19th birthday. And you right here, he wrote home, and he was telling too much. And his letter, I got it, but I was so old I didn't want to bring it, but there things cut out of it. They censored his letter because he was telling them too much of what he knew, what was going on. So that, we found out that a lot. And because of alphabetical order, he got mess hall duty, and he had to peel potatoes all day. So for a young man, that was something new. He went on the Ile de France, which at that time was one of the third largest ship across, and they went all the way over to Glasgow. It took them 8 days. Now, this is an interesting story. Somewhere at sea, he writes about what the life was like on the sea, feeding the fish, the bad food, all those kind of things. And a lot of it gets censored as he's talking back. But his big thrill was Mickey Rooney was on that ship. He was going across to be part of the troops, entertaining the troops. My dad was bragging he got to play craps and cards with Mickey Rooney. You know, that was the last thing he should have been worried about. So he gets over there, and he's in England, stayed one night, and then he came into across the channel, and you can see he got really sick because it was so bad, terrible food. You heard that from Jack Dressen. And he came into Le Havre over in this part of the area. So anybody you know what a 40 and 8 is? It's a train that they had at that time with the boxcar, and you took care of 8 horses or 40 men. So they put 40 men in every boxcar to get them from Le Havre to Linden, Germany, where he was going, Aachen, Germany, where he was going. His description of how it smelled in that boxcar, can you imagine 40 men and smoking and doing other things in that boxcar, what it's like to ride that far in a train? It was, I didn't want to put that down. And there's a picture of him waiting in Germany to figure out what he's going to do. So while the men are over in fighting the war, the women in the United States have taken over. They're working, they're doing those kind of things. I thought it would be important to see what my mother was talking about. My mother got together with other women in town, and after her first year of teaching here, she went back to her hometown of Holdingford to teach so she could live with her mom and dad while Dad was in the war. The women got together every night and listened to the radio. The big band orchestras would be playing on the radio for the women back here. And then they received manuals on how to do a victory garden, how to save coffee, how to knit, and then they would roll bandages. That was what they would do every night, the loyalty. But this is the one that really gets to me. They were willing to sacrifice everything, and you see they had to buy things by stamps so that people wouldn't hoard things. And being a teacher, she had to wear nylons. And you could only get nylons alphabetically so often. And I don't know if you remember the nylons of the 40s, but they had that seam in the back, you know, and they tore a lot. And because her last name was R, she didn't get called a Herbert or Store very often. And she said it took a long time for that first pair. I had a friend who could mend a run so it didn't show. Can you imagine having to wear those nylons that way so you could get nylons on that? So interesting, those of you that knew my grandfather, he had the tire and battery shop, and for some reason he was fortuitous and knew that when the war started that there would be conscription, that you had to have stamps to buy tires and batteries. And my dad and his sisters and brother tell the story about on the day of Pearl Harbor, they went to his shop and took all the tractor tires out and all the batteries out, and he hid them in his house underneath the beds and all those kind of things. And he let the farmers know that they wouldn't have to go to his store to buy it with they could buy it under the table or on the black market from him. So, but then he also knew that he couldn't put that money in the bank. So what he did was he took all the money and put them in Folger's coffee cans and buried them in his yard. Now yesterday, Jerry Smith was here. The Smiths bought that land. From the day that my grandpa sold that land, we were at my house. My cousin Jerry and I found out again about this, and we got the great idea. We went over to his land. We dug holes all over. There might be some, you want to go over there, you might going to be find a coffee can. My mom tells the story of when Dad got out of the Army, and a year later when they could afford buying the house that we lived in all our life on Highway 71, they went to Grandpa and said, would you loan us the money? And he said, sure, and he went out and dug up 2 coffee cans, gave my mother 2 coffee cans with $1,000 in each one, and she walked to the bank to give him that money. She said, I've never been so nervous in all my life. The coffee can. So, well, getting back to the story. Before my dad went really into combat, he was in various places, and he tells the story. But what was interesting, remember, he got on that ship the day he turned 19, which would have been in September, and right here he says, new address change, darn good chow here, even had pie. I even got to take my first shower today since I left the States. And we're talking about over a month of time. So it wasn't pretty, I'm sure, yeah. Sleeping in tents and all that kind of stuff. I think he's being set up, thinking that it was going to be pretty easy at this point in time. It turns for him. So now that gets us into the Battle of the Bulge. And some of you know the Battle of the Bulge. It was a horrendous battle, but I'm going to focus on one part of it. You can't focus on all of it because there were so many battles within the battle. So just to get you a little background for you, it was the seminal battle in World War II for us. It's the one that changed the direction of the war. It began because Hitler felt like if he could come through Belgium and go past up into Antwerp and take that area, he would be able to win the war. That was his plan. And they were, as you can see up there, I'm not going to go through it, they spent everything they had, all their tanks, all their good men, to fight the Battle of the Bulge. And they were banking on it when they started. What they didn't know, what they couldn't bank on, was what the weather was. And we'll get into that in just a second. So that was Germany. They were well prepared. Picture yourself, all 19-year-olds, never been in battle like my dad. You're not ready to fight a battle. So we took a really big hit at the beginning, and as you can see that, we didn't do very good. And the story is our troops had the summer uniforms on. My dad talks about that. And they were wearing summer uniforms, and it was the coldest, snowiest winter ever in Belgium. So they were in snow up this high, and it was below zero a lot, and they had their summer clothes that they were fighting it in. So we started out with, what's that old saying, 1 foot in a hole as we started going through this. The other thing that Hitler did that was really smart was he took his smartest people and taught them that could speak English, taught them American customs, taught them how to pack a cigarette, how to smoke a cigarette, how to hold a fork, how to carry on a conversation. And what he did was when these people would go out and they'd find a dead American soldier, they'd put on American uniforms and they'd get in with the American soldiers, and they just made a travesty of what we were trying to do. They blew up bridges, they gave false orders, they changed road signs and all those kinds of things. Smart on Hitler, we didn't catch on to that for a while. So that also put us into a bad position. So the Germans made a real good run at it at the early part of the war. So my dad is waiting for his orders, and we get so many people that are killed and can't be in their companies that my dad got transferred from the 9th Army to the 1st Army into George Patton, and he says, we had the blood and he had the guts, and he was assigned as a rail splitter to get into the Battle of the Bulge. So the seminal point of the Battle of the Bulge was Bastogne, Belgium. So as you can see on this, the Germans are coming from the south, 3 different areas. There's Bastogne, and a lot of times you hear of the Battle of the Bulge called the Battle of the Ardennes. This is the hills and the woods on the other side of the Bastogne. The Germans were wanting to get up into Antwerp, okay? General Patton was in Germany at that point in time, and he marched his troops from Germany over here. My dad was part of that march. So you can see the Germans coming in. Jack Dressen's group was in the 3rd. They were coming from behind. My dad's group is coming from here, and the British division was coming from here, and they all were meeting to have the Battle of the Bulge, okay? So when we were going to visit, my son said, we can't just drive around there. We don't know the area. So he did a search and found a guy that gave tours of the Battle of the Bulge out of Bastogne. and he sent the note to Henry, and Henry said, I'll gladly do it. You need to send me your dad's name, rank, serial number, all those kind of things, so I can give you a personal tour. So little did we know, when we met him at this tank at noon, what he was going to tell me. There's Henry. He walked up to me, and he put his hand out, and he said, Mr. Achter, I need to tell you this. I was 8 years old in the war. My little hometown is a few miles from here. We had the SS Germans were in our town. Your dad's little company of 17 people, which registered with me, liberated that town, and I shook your dad's hand. I shook all 17. He said, I'd never been able to do that before. And I go, wow. And he was emotional. You can imagine how we felt on that. He gave us an unbelievable tour that we never would have had because of that, in finding out where Dad went during this time. So Bastogne was devastated. There's a picture on the left during the war. There's a night that Chris and I spent there on how it's rebuilt. So what also helped authenticate this, I was able to locate a booklet that was put out by the called the Battle of the Ardennes on the rail splitter group that just authenticated everything that I've been doing in my research. And this is, I'm going to go through this pretty quick because you don't need to know all the stuff about it, but and you don't have to read everything. But the 84th Infantry that my dad got there marched 75 miles in a couple of days, and they took over Marche, which I'll show you in just a second. But here's what it had to say. There's my dad. You can see they had their summer uniforms on. Some of them had boots, and this is a story of it. It talks about the snow, it talks about the hills, it talks about the woods, and how bad it was trying to make it there. So this is Bastogne here. Here's the infantry coming here, and here's Marche, and this is all Ardennes. So you get an idea of what the map that they were at. So my dad was an advanced scout, and I don't know if you know what an advanced scout was. He's part of the infantry, and two people get sent out a couple hundred yards or further out with a radio, and they radio back to the artillery, which Jack Dressen talked about earlier, and then the artillery shoots, and then when it lands, they radio and say, well, good thing you missed us, you're off a little bit, and they tell them where to go. So, but because they were there, his job was to find a spot, the big guns shoot, but they couldn't have anything on them to give them identification because there's a real good chance they were going to get captured by the Germans. My dad was so in love with my mother that he put her picture in his cap. And during the whole time that he was out there, when he wasn't, he was looking at her and praying the rosary that he'd make it through. So, and this talks about doing that. I don't know if you know Tom Charnowski. He was in the Cactus Division, and he marched also the whole time during that time. So again, here's what it looked like, the terrain. It's unbelievable in 44. There's the exact same spot when we were going through. You know, this is 2013. They have roads and all that kind of stuff now, but a contrast of the weather and all things during December when we were there. So now there's another part of the story that a lot of people don't know about. While the fighting was going on in the Ardennes, there was also fighting going on in Bastogne. General Anthony McAuliffe and the 101st were in Bastogne, and they were, remember I showed you, they were circled by the Germans, and the Germans felt for sure if they took Bastogne, they were going to win. And they had us circled, okay? So, and they had infiltrated, and the German commander sent a man who knew English in to talk to General Anthony McAuliffe to give up, okay? So they came in with their white flags, and they got taken with blindfolds into his office, and they had a letter saying, you're surrounded, you should give up, and it talks about that there. McAuliffe read it, and he said, nuts. And he put it back in that German's hand, and the German didn't understand what nuts meant, and another guy said it means go to hell. So he went back, and that's when the Americans were able to break through and win Bastogne. Well, we were at that same time, Marche, it took them 2 days to get into Marche. You'll see what it was like for my dad's troop. And then they were told they were going to go from Marche to down to take Rochefort, which, as you can see, there's so Marche, I forgot to tell you. This is Marche, and you see this high castle that's right up there. That's where Patton was directing the war during the time. That's Marche in 2013. So one of the things that my dad told me was, the only thing he said when I told him we were going over, he said, make sure you find Marloway, because that's where I was a prisoner of war. So I told Henry, and he said, well, wait. So we got to there, and we get there, and he gets right here, and it shows where the roads are, and he said, unfortunately, Marloway was so beat up that they never put it back together. So I couldn't show my dad where he was a prisoner of war for a while. And the story there is, he was in a school, went out was going out in the country to make the call. A German got him and put his hands behind his back and was taking him off. And in his story, he says, I thought I was going to be dead. I'd never make it back. And another American saw that and came up behind the German and captured the German, and my dad was let free again. So that was an act of God and that kind of a thing. All the troops during Christmas, what was it like to be a troop during Christmas? This is a fun story. Jack Dressen talks about his mother sent him 2 packages. One package was a chicken, one package was a fruitcake. And they were out in the thing, and they started a fire and took the helmet off of one guy, and when they put the package that they thought was the chicken, and heated it up, and they opened it up, and it was a fruitcake. And he says in this story, it was a fruitcake, and they thought, so we opened the other can thinking it had to be the fruit, and it was a chicken, and it was cold, and we ate the chicken cold, and ate the fruitcake hot. So, yeah. So, again, the terrain was really bad. You can see it was so bad the tanks couldn't stay on the roads. This is the same road there that we visited. You can see the terrain during that time. And the only way they could go, they found, was by cutting down the trees, taking the branches off, and putting them down, and then having the tanks go across that way. That's that same area, and that's a plaque that talks about what they did during that time to secure the area. It was so bad because of the snow that the artillery got away from the infantry, and the Germans were smart. They had let booby traps, so they couldn't go very far at all, because you had to check the grounds to make sure you weren't going to be taking on a booby trap. There you can see 2 pictures of what it was like when we were there and what it was like when the troops were in the snow during that. Imagine yourself with having no boots that were protective and having regular clothes on during that time. So there you just see what La Roche was like. That was the next place they were going. They went through 4-foot drifts to go there. So there's where that little town of Marloway was. And once they took Rochefort, they went back, and then they had to go to La Roche, and it's not very far, but they couldn't make very much time because of the weather there. So there you'll see, and the weather was so bad they didn't get their chow very often, and when they did, it was just cold. We went into La Roche, and there's a plaque to the 335th rail splitters. They got together at that time with a group from the British, and my dad did talk about the Orthe River, and it ran right down the middle of the town, and he talked about getting an area, and so there's the group that he was in, and there's this side hill, and we never would have found this. Here's a plaque dedicated to the soldiers that took La Roche and took the Orthe River, and there's the Orthe River in 2013. So just imagine yourself knowing you're walking where your dad walked during the war. So because my dad couldn't have his name, rank, and serial number on him, they were trained that if you get captured by Americans and you are American, they're going to ask you some questions to make sure you're American. And they'd ask state capitals, movie stars, names of the president, dog, and those kind of things. So one day, when my dad was out, he was captured by his American people, thinking that he was a German, and they put him through this questioning, and they were ready to throw him in because he was a German, he and his buddy, and they were able to answer all those questions, and then they proved that they were Americans during that whole time. I can't imagine what being 19 and having that happen to me. So they then took a little rest because of everything I've showed you and what they've gone through. They took a couple of days rest. And during that time, my dad and 5 other people were out at a farm, and they wanted to stay warm, and they found this straw and wood, and they had snowbanks on top, and they decided that they were going to go inside of there to rest for a couple of days. Well, my dad was the first one in. One guy found a smudge pot, and one guy found a battery, and so they were going to heat the thing. And when one guy lit the cigarette, the smudge pot and battery exploded. And everybody made it out but my dad. And my dad was burned heavily on his arms and his face, and I don't know if you ever noticed that his arms were really black during that time as he got older, and he lost all of his teeth and that whole thing. So, and he couldn't let people know. He was taken back. They wanted him to go in the hospital, but he said no because he knew the way his brother John was treated. So he just hung around until he sort of healed up, and then he went back with the troops. So they went from La Roche, and then they went down to Hoflazé, and that's when they fought some fierce battles in this area. And there's Henry and I with a plaque that's dedicated to my dad's group as their and the soldiers that were killed during that battle. And so we got the opinion from my mom that she was really nervous about this, and so I'm thinking a lot about this. My mom was living in Holdingford, and my mom's best friend was Mary Boats, and Mary Boats' daughter is a good friend of mine. And I'm talking to Patty Boat, and she said, you know, my mom's fiance was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. And here's what she had to say about it. Mary was in the cities, found out her fiance was killed, came back to Holdingford, grieved the whole time. Her sister's boyfriend was lost at sea and all and that sort of put things together. He had been a Johnny, and there talks about him. And then we're talking again, and my Aunt Adeline was going out with one of the Drung boys. Remember Gus Drung, the Drung family? Yeah. Well, Danny Drung and my Aunt Adeline were going out, and the Drungs, you know, were part of the Blue Derbies. And my aunt was sort of the first groupie. She'd go out with him, and then Danny got drafted as in the war, and Danny gets killed. And so Adeline continues to go with the Blue Derbies as she's grieving. Bob Drung, Gus's other brother, is part of it, and then she marries Bob Drung, Danny's brother. So my mom is knowing this, and she's going through really tension about, is my Leo going to make it out of the war? And I think most women were thinking that same thing. So here's again a picture of what it was like in '45, what it was like when we got to Hoflazé the day we were there. There's a plaque that talks about the 85th 4th Infantry and what the 335th and what they did to make Hoflazé. There's Hoflazé of the battle. And this is the town right next to it that Henry lived in. And Henry talked a lot about this, this tank. This tank was upside down in the river, and they played on that tank a lot after that. So, I mean, you know Henry's telling us the truth on that part. So, at that same time, Jack Dressen, with his artillery, they're cut out away from people, and they're at a point where they know that the Germans are going to be coming the next morning, and they're by themselves. And this is totally Jack Dressen, if you know him. We dug in as deep as we could and camouflaged as best we could. Heinsberger hid the Jeep to the left of our hole in a group of trees near the crossroads where we had been told to go. We waited and we prayed. I couldn't hear Heinsberger, but I saw his lips moving, so he must have been praying softly. I was saying the rosary. I must have been loud enough that Beatty to hear me, because he asked me what I was doing. I told him I was praying on my beads. He said, "Teach me how to do it." I said, "Just listen, Ray. that will help. We don't have time for him to do any teaching. And as the story goes, the next morning they woke up. Do I have this? Yeah. The next morning they got up and Jack Dressen heard the tanks coming, and they were all ready to shoot. And Jack saw that it was American tanks, and the American tanks saved them at that point in time. And if you know Rick Dressen, he and his wife Carrie visited this area, had a tour guide, and authenticated that all this was had happened also. But there's Jack Dressen's picture after the Battle of the Bulge. So we're getting through January right now, and it's one of the hardest fought. The Germans had invested 28 divisions. They lost 90,000 to 100,000 men, and the Germans had moved like 40,000 vehicles. And what happened was Hitler overestimated the weather. He didn't think the weather was bad, but they ran out of gas. So most of their tanks and most of the things couldn't go anyplace, and we had that. So right there, we took over the Battle of the Bulge because they had underestimated the gas for their machines. So somewhere in this whole thing, my dad sends a letter home that he was offered a Purple Heart, like my Uncle John, but they turned it down because they didn't want to have my grandma and grandpa back here worried that they were in trouble in the war. So there's the memorial out of Bastogne to the Battle of the Bulge. Well, when the Battle of the Bulge is over with, the war isn't over with. It continues to go. So my dad's group and everybody keeps fighting. And my dad's group met the Russians on May 7th. He had been on the front lines, this 19-year-old, for 158 straight days battling. So he said, I'll tell you more when I get home. So at the Elbe River, they met the Russians, and they were there for VE Day on May 7th. So this talks a little bit about what had happened to him. He's finally, this is after the war, and he's waiting there to get called over to the European station, and he talks a little bit about how he got burned up and the whole. Here's my favorite part of this, to share with you. Starlets were sent over there, and this is Marlena Diedrich, who went to the troops. Here's Betty Grable, and you can see the rail splitter patch on her jacket right there to perform in front of the troops. After my dad died, I was going through his stuff, and they had a newspaper that came out like every week to the troops. And I went through, and I'm just kicking myself because I only took a black and white picture of it, and then I lost it. But there's these lipstick on it. And my best guess is, and I did the research, the troops didn't want their autograph. They wanted them to kiss it so they'd have that lipstick with them as they're fighting. So that's probably Betty Great. Yeah. What a great thing. Yeah. So my dad wanted to get married to my mom. This is a letter that he sent to his Adeline sometime in '45. She and I have been making big plans for when I got home. My mom wrote that she and Dad want me to wait. Damn it. I'm wasting the best years of my life away. I really hope we can take that final big step when I get home. So there's the medals that my dad won during the war, and he writes about a big surprise of Medal of Conduct and all those kind of to my daughter thing. Jack Dressen's medals. He was stationed somewhere ready to go over to Europe, but to Japan in that area, but they got stuck in Australia, and this was during Christmas time, and being good Catholic, he was really disappointed in the Christmas mass that he went to, checking on his cousins, and in the spring he was finally able to be shipped home, and there's a picture of him before he gets on that ship to come home. And when you read Brokaw's book, it says they were proud what they have accomplished, but they rarely discussed their experiences, even with each other when they came back. My best guess is that if you knew somebody who was in the World War or any time, that was really true. There's my Uncle John when he came back, and people had a tough time finding jobs. He had to live in a Quonset hut in St. Paul looking for a job. There's John and his wife Bernice and his son Dick, and my grandpa and John and Dick. Jack Dressen came back, went to college at St. Thomas, and was having a really tough time with a math class, and he was told that there was this Joe Schmelzer in Chaska that was a math teacher, and he would line him up with taking lessons from Joe. So Mrs. Dressen taught Mr. Dressen mathematics, and that's how they met and got married, and then the rest is history about him. And we've got the souls here. Here's a picture of Joe's soul coming back, and you know, we probably hadn't heard of War Brides. There's Daisy's soul when they came back from England, and the story about how Joe's soul met Daisy and got married, and I think was Lawrence born in England, and they came back with Lawrence, and we all know Daisy and the mom, as she was known as for her. There's the picture of my dad in June of '46 getting back. My aunt and uncle, my grandma and grandpa, so happy that my dad had made it back. And 2 months later, 1 month later, they were married in Holdingford, Minnesota. And he had a hard time finding a job. He worked at the milk plant for a while, and then some of you probably, he was your rural letter carrier his whole life, and lived that common life. So he lived his whole life not being able to get disability for all the things that he went through, and because he didn't go to a hospital, and because he didn't take the Purple Heart, people wouldn't believe his disability. About 3 months before he died, he went to the VA in St. Cloud, and they gave him disability. It was probably, and no back, just he had 3, and he was so proud that he finally got disability. Never been recognized. This is my dad in May of 2014, and I'm so thankful. This man is from Sauk Rapids, and he had learned that Dad was in the St. Benedict Rest Home. You can see he's got oxygen, and they gave him a certificate for what he did during World War II. My sister Barb was there, and she said it's the proudest she's ever felt, my dad, that somebody finally recognized what he had done in the war. And 1 week later, he passed away. And there's his funeral. And probably one of the biggest moments of my life was to get his flag. So, yeah. So, thanks to Sue, here are the names of all of the people from the Browerville area that were in World War II, and you'll see that many of them, there were so many people, I went through that too fast for you. There were so many people that had 5 or 6 or 7 members of their family in World War II. So, some of you know people that were in the war, or you've been in and you'd like your story told a little bit. There's my email address. Email me. I'd love to interview you so I can put together something for all of us to remember. Thanks for hanging in there. Thanks for listening today. I really appreciate the time we've had together. A couple of things before we leave. We do have another drawing, I think, but this place is open until 4 o'clock again today. You know that we're trying to get a museum going, and Al, do you want to talk a little bit quickly about that museum that we're looking at?
Sure. Thank you to everybody in attendance here today. It's really great to see you all. The gathering last year in St. Cloud, that basically is the beginning of the Browerville Legacy Museum. I got through with my little talk for the city last year, and Jane said, "Come here. Why don't you start a museum?" So the rest is kind of a history. I feel very strongly it's very important, and as the sign says, preserving history for those that follow or for the future. Browerville is probably the last community in Todd County that doesn't have a museum. And yet, look at all of the famous people and important people that are from our town and area. It's long overdue. So I hope the community will support us like I think we need. It's very important. I want to say a big thank you to Sue for military display and all she does for the military. We sat together in council for a few years when I was on city council, but a big amount of gratitude to Sue. I also want to give a big thank you to Jane and Ron Brown. They are the instrumental people of putting all this together. Hours and hours and hours of research. We owe a huge amount of gratitude to them and their team. Of course, you can't do these things all alone, but again, terrific. And to anybody I forgot, we also owe a big debt of gratitude to Chuck Achter and putting together his presentation. Thank you, Chuck. And some people said I'm a man of a few words. I'll try and keep it that way. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you. So, make sure you got a ticket. Everybody got a ticket right now?